I know that we've been just starting to get rolling in our series in the book of James, just finishing the first chapter. But for the next month, we're actually going to break from James and we're going to be looking at the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And there are a few reasons for this, just some generic reasons, but some other reasons as well. One of the reasons is that earlier this year, the first of 4 volumes in a work that's been 50 years in the making by the world's leading expert on the resurrection, an evangelical by the name of Gary Habermas, was published. The first volume, about 1,000 pages, on the evidences for the resurrection. A second reason, however, is the fact that our emphasis this year as a church is on the stark warning of Jesus Christ, who warned that unless you believe that he is who he claims to be, you will die in your sins. And so we were emphasizing this year that we need to be soul winners for Christ. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 declares that the foundation of the gospel message is not just that Jesus died on the cross, but it includes his physical bodily resurrection. If we do not believe in the resurrection, there is no salvation. If the resurrection never happened, Paul says, there is no salvation. We are still in our sins and be most to be pitied. Now, in the internet age, in the ages of blogs and different postings and such, the proliferation of utter nonsense is really astounding. People who claim to have solid arguments but are anything otherwise are posting about the resurrection and all kinds of things, claiming it never happened. And sadly, most people get their theology from blog posts, tweets, Instagram, whatever it is, and not from the Bible. And especially younger people, and I've had some of the younger people in the church ask me questions about different things that some of their friends have asked them, and it's really amazing that common sense is anything but common nowadays, and people will believe literally anything. In the past, we've looked at the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and perhaps it seemed like a deep dive then, but we're going to take a really deep dive into the resurrection. Not going to leave anybody behind in this study, but hopefully after we've gone through it, you'll be able to remember enough of the broad details that if you encounter people that this is a difficulty for them, a stumbling block for them, then you'll be able to satisfactorily answer their questions. If you remember back in your school days, often you would study and study and study, and you would remember a vast amount, but a little bit later on, you only remembered the salient points. That's what I'm hoping that you will remember as we go through this, is the most important points. You're not going to remember all of the details, but I want you to have the broad arguments so that you can answer questions. Now, before we just dive into the details on the resurrection, there's some prolegomata that we need to look at, some things beforehand, because we can't just start in what for many people would be the middle. Because sadly enough, if we were going to start where we really need to start, we would have to look at a philosophy of history to begin with. And there is a whole field of study within philosophy where people are they're just taken by the question of what is history? Is it something that we can even access? And in our radical skeptic age in which we live, our postmodern age in which we live, there are many people who believe that history is something that no one has access to, and so it's a moot point to even consider these things because there is no way of knowing at all. Now, in the real world, we don't function that way at all. We function as though history is knowable, and even though there are many radicals who believe that we cannot access the past, the vast majority of scholars still believe that we can have a good grasp and understanding of the past historical events. And this is important because you're going to see here that there is a two-tiered system or a double standard. Because if somebody is studying ancient Roman history or ancient Greek history or ancient Egyptian history, they believe that they can access the past through certain tools and methodology. And yet when it comes to the study of the Bible and the historical events that the Bible mentions, they believe that you can't use the same tools. And there's no reason for this other than bias. And so when the Bible makes, for instance, claims about the resurrection of Jesus Christ, we are going to see that the same tools that any ancient historian would use, for instance, if they're trying to figure out about the life and the deeds of somebody like Alexander the Great, if we apply the same criteria to the life of Jesus Christ, to the resurrection of Jesus Christ, then we can find out whether or not it actually happened. And so we need to make sure that people don't have a bias that is an erroneous bias or a bias that shouldn't be there because it's not scholastic, it's not academic, it's not true. And so we would need to start with a philosophy of history, but I'm going to start with a philosophy of history that is what the vast majority of historians in any field argue for, and that is we can, within reasonable grounds and reasonable degree, understand the past using the correct tools. There are some things that we will never be able to know from the past because there's no evidence or data or facts that remain. It's gone. But there are many things in the past that we do have access to through archaeology, through literary texts, and there are ways to piece together the past. And so we don't need a radical skepticism because there is no need for any radical skepticism. If you were to apply the radical skepticism to biblical studies, then you would have to apply it to all other ancient historical studies, and then we would just have to throw up our hands and say, before today, we don't know anything because we don't have direct access to the past. We can only know the present. And that, to me, is just sheer nonsense. The next thing we need to look at, and if you're taking notes, you're going to want to jot some of these down because they're going to come up over and over again, and that is there are tools at the disposal of the historian in order to figure out whether or not something actually happened. So if there's a claim from the past, how do we know that it happened? How do we know that Abraham Lincoln was assassinated? Well, we would use historical tools to reconstruct the past to find out whether or not Abraham Lincoln was actually assassinated or not. And because of those tools, everybody believes that Abraham Lincoln was, in fact, assassinated. Or a more recent example, which is beyond my lifespan, would be the assassination of JFK. How do we know that it actually happened? Well, in that case, there's video, there's all kinds of medical records, pictures, there's all kinds of stuff that we can reconstruct the past. We might not know all of the different things involved in how it happened and who was behind it and all these things, but as far as the fact that was JFK killed in Dallas on that day? So when we're looking at the ancient past, it's the same thing. So let me give you some criteria. Scholars call this the criteria of authenticity. Okay, so Historians use this, biblical scholars use this, they use the same tools. Okay, it doesn't matter if you're a professional mechanic or you're just a backyard mechanic, you use the same tools, right? If you need a screwdriver, you use a screwdriver. If you need a wrench, you need a wrench. So it's this cross-discipline. They use the same tools. One of these, and they're not in any particular order, but one of these is that, generally speaking, the earlier the source, the better. If it's close to the time of the events, it's more likely to be true than something that is hundreds of years later. Not always the case, but the general rule is the closer in time the recording is, the better. So this one is pretty straightforward. Now, in the study of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, the earliest account is actually found in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Because Paul makes reference there in verses 3 through 8 to receiving early testimony. What he receives, he passes on. And even the most liberal scholar believes that Paul's account there is the earliest account of the resurrection. In fact, scholars would date this. This is even liberal, critical scholars who do not believe in the resurrection or anything. They would believe that this account actually goes back to the early or the mid-30s. If Christ died in 30 or 33, then this is within 2, 3, 4 years of the actual events. So it's early. Some of the ancient historical things that you were taught in school as definite facts, the information we have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1,000 years after the events, and yet we believe them. This is early, within a few years. In fact, if you read later on, Paul actually says, for instance, about the 500 who are witnesses to the resurrection, he says some are dead, but many are still alive. Go and ask them. And so it's early testimony, which that example picks up on the next criteria, and that is eyewitness accounts are stronger than non-eyewitness accounts. If somebody was actually there and saw it happening, then their account is more credible than somebody who wasn't there. Somebody who got it secondhand, third hand, fourth hand. Or somebody who's just relying on what somebody else said who may or may not have been an eyewitness, and they may or may not have communicated it properly, or they may not have written it down properly. See, the more the links there are in the chain, the more it gets changed. You know the story of the fish? The first time the story is told, the fish is this big. Second time, third time. By the time you're done, the fish is bigger than the boat. So you want early and eyewitness accounts. Now, we will not have time to go into this because I don't want this to take the rest of the year to do it, although I would find it fascinating. But a leading New Testament scholar by the name of Richard Bauckham, he actually looked into this question on the gospel material. Was it written, was it recorded, is the evidence there written by eyewitnesses? And he has produced an airtight argument, and the book's been out for 15 years now, so it's gone through a second edition, and critics have tried to pull it apart, and they can't. That the testimony of the gospel writers is eyewitness testimony. Now, just stop here for a second as far as our apologetics are concerned and sharing this with our friends or whoever. People are going to say, you can't use the Bible. Nonsense. Whether or not, especially the theology is true or not, the gospel accounts represent what the individual writers believed to be true. And so, just like any ancient document, They receive the benefit of the doubt first, innocent until proven guilty. You cannot say because it's a religious book that therefore the contents are by definition false. You cannot do that. You have to prove that the contents are false. Because if you applied that to ancient history, almost everything that we have would have to be thrown out, because you would say there's some bias involved in the production of those works. And so in the least, whether or not you believe that Jesus is God, that he is God incarnate, all this, you would have to believe that those documents represent historically what the authors truly believed. And so we can use them, and we should use them, and they have eyewitness testimony to what's going on. Let me give you another one. This is probably among ancient historians the number one: multiple independent attestation. That is, if you have multiple independent accounts that are saying the same thing, then the argument is stronger. So in the case of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, if you have 2, 3, 4 different sources that are giving the same testimony, and they're not collaborating, then that strengthens the case. Now, in the Gospels, depending on your position on the synoptic gospel, which was your Matthew, Mark, and Luke, who borrowed from whom, or did they borrow at all, we still have multiple sources. Okay, most scholars believe, now I don't hold to this view, but most scholars believe that Mark wrote first and Matthew and Luke borrowed from Mark. So we have one source there because they're basically just borrowing from Mark, except in those places where Mark doesn't write or where they differ from Mark. So in those places they differ, you would have a second source. But all scholars agree that John didn't use anybody, because 3/4 of the Gospel of John is unique material. It's not covered in the synoptic Gospels. So you at least have 2 sources. Now, just to put this in perspective, Paul Meyer, who's retired now, but he was a world-renowned ancient historian. He actually is an evangelical Christian as well, but he was world-class in his ancient historical scholarship. And he says this: many facts from antiquity rest on just one ancient source, while 2 or 3 sources in agreement generally render the fact unimpeachable. So he's saying, listen, if historians looking at ancient Rome, ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, if they have 2 or 3 independent sources, it's unimpeachable. It happened. Well, the resurrection of Jesus Christ, we have multiple sources, because we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Why do I say that? Because we have places where only Matthew has certain details. Okay, so he didn't borrow from Mark, he didn't borrow from Luke, he got it from somewhere, but it's independent. We have Luke, who says some things that are only in Luke, they're not anywhere else. We have Mark, and we have John that's independent, and we have Paul. We have 5 independent sources for the resurrection. That's unimpeachable according to the standards of ancient historical study. Now, we'll look at these in the weeks to come. But multiple attestation is probably the most important one of these. Okay, there are other ones. I'm not going to give you all of them. I'm going to give you the ones I think are the most important. Another one is called the principle or the criteria of embarrassment. Generally speaking, if you're making up a story, you don't make yourself look like a fool. If anything, you make yourself the hero or neutral. But you try to smooth out or get rid of the embarrassing parts. And yet in the Gospels, we have all kinds of embarrassing stuff. Let me give you a couple of the biggest examples. Who is the de facto leader of the apostles? The one who always speaks up. Peter. So shouldn't we make Peter the hero? And yet Peter, when Jesus tells him he's going to die, Peter says, to paraphrase, no, over my dead body. And then Jesus said, before the cock crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. Are you going to put that in there? Make Peter look that bad? And actually give the details on how he actually does it? You only put that in if it actually happens. So this is what's called the criteria of embarrassment. Here's another one. I mentioned this a few weeks ago when we were beginning the study of the book of James. But when the church began to grow and develop, so we have a decade or two going by, who becomes the head of the church throughout the world? And it's not Peter. James does. More and more scholars today believe that James became the preeminent figure of the church in the world. We see this at the Jerusalem Council. We see how Peter responds in Galatians when certain men from James had come, and there's some other details which suggest that James took the position of prominence. But if you go to Mark 3 and you look in the Gospel of John, you find out that Jesus' brothers didn't believe in him. They actually thought he was crazy. That doesn't make James look good. Why put it in there? Because it's true. It happened. One last one because of time. Who are the first witnesses of the resurrection? The women. In the ancient world, women's testimony was considered virtually useless. Okay, there's famous quotes about this. I won't share any now. About how they disregarded women's testimony. Thought, oh, they're all just emotional and stuff, so you can't believe anything they say. So if you're inventing a story, one, if you're going to put in the story of Peter denying Jesus 3 times, then you're going to have Peter the first one there because you want Peter to kind of do a 180 and now he's the hero of the story. But no, we have the women, and then the men don't even believe the women. So the men look bad again. But if you're making up the story, you don't do it. That's a criterion of embarrassment. You only put that there if it actually happened. What about the disciples? What did they do after Jesus died? They fled the city. They went back to their fishing. Why put that in there if you're making it all up? Because it happened. So that's called the criteria of embarrassment. Now, another one that's really important is called enemy attestation. If somebody hates your guts, they're more likely than not to stick up for you. They want you to get in trouble. They want you to look bad. But if your enemy says something about you in your defense, then that has added weight because they're not biased towards you. They're actually biased against you. So let's say a car accident happens. Somebody claims it's your fault, and somebody who is your worst enemy, let's just play with our minds here. Somebody who's your worst enemy comes alongside and says, no, they didn't do it. It was the other person. Well, that has added weight because it's not the spouse, it's not the child, it's not their best friend. It's somebody who hates their guts. And if they're willing to say that's happening, then it has added weight. Well, we have evidences of this in the New Testament. For instance, how do we know that the tomb was empty? Because the Jews told us it was. The Jewish religious leaders who hated Jesus, who wanted to stomp out Jesus and his followers, they told us the tomb was empty. How did they do that? They said the disciples stole the body, which means the body wasn't in the tomb. So how strong is that? Well, it's strong because They want to squash this. They're going to go to the tomb, find out where the body is, present it to everybody, and say, see, he's dead. And if that's the case, then the whole movement is over, because nobody's going to believe in a dead Messiah. So keep these things in place, because as we go through, we're going to be seeing how these things come up over and over and over again. And what we're trying to communicate to people is that the same rational tools that are used by any historian are used by the Gospels writers to show that the resurrection actually happened. By the way, if you like forensics and stuff like that, it's the same tools that they use in investigations to try to find out what happened. So they go and interview all the people, and they try to put the stories together. They want eyewitnesses who know what happened. So they're going to put all of these pieces together. Okay, a couple other things here before we even dive in anymore is, sadly, you know what? Today, because of the internet, you would actually have to begin, even before this, with answering the question, did Jesus even ever exist? That's a ridiculous question, but there's programs on things like the Discovery Channel or the History Channel or internet posts all over the place where people are claiming that Jesus never even exists, that this is called the mythic view, that the either Paul is the founder of Christianity or somebody, and they made all this up. In other words, they were starting here, and they needed a backstory for their religion. And so you create this mythical figure, Jesus. In fact, there's some scholars today who are actually using that very argument as far as Islam is concerned. There's a guy named Robert Spencer who wrote a book called Did Muhammad Really Exist? Trying to look at the historical arguments to see whether or not some of the founders of Islam actually made him up in order to give a backstory to it. And there are many people nowadays who are claiming that this is in fact the case with Christianity. Jesus of Nazareth is a fictitious character. He never existed. Now, it's interesting if you have somebody who's really bought into this, get them to go to the public library, because sadly the public library, if you go to the Christian section, they carry all the stuff from the radical liberals. But there's a radical liberal by the name of Bart Ehrman. And Bart Ehrman considers himself to be an agnostic/atheist. He has no axe to grind against historical Christianity, but he has an axe to grind against conservative evangelicals. So he doesn't like us. So he doesn't have a horse in the race. He just wants to look at the historical data. He doesn't believe in the resurrection. But he wrote a whole book called Did Jesus Exist? And the reason he wrote it is to take issue with all these people online, and some of them have PhDs behind their names, like Richard Carrier and some others, who are trying to argue that Jesus never existed, and he just obliterates them all. So the reason that's a good resource is this. It's not somebody who is an evangelical Christian who has a theological reason for defending the existence of Jesus. You have somebody who is just looking at it from a neutral historical perspective, and he shows that there's no evidence whatsoever to support the fact that Jesus of Nazareth never lived. In fact, there are at least 12 sources that show that Jesus lived. We have them from first century Jewish historian Josephus. We have them from Roman historians like Tacitus. We have it from a Syrian by the name of Bar Serapion. We have Emperor Trajan. We have a guy named Livy, Pliny the Younger. There's all kinds of writers who aren't Christians who are saying and make mention of Jesus and the fact that he lived. Now, that's enough about that one, but just so you know, if you see some blog post and somebody seems to have credentials and they're saying, Jesus never lived, or somebody brings you that argument, it's absolute, sheer, total nonsense. Okay, one last one that's part of our prolegomena is this: the existence of miracles. Some people will write off the fact of the resurrection because they are philosophical naturalists, which means they would say miracles by definition are impossible. The resurrection, because dead people stay dead, is a miracle, therefore it never happened. It's impossible. So it doesn't matter how much evidence you give, it is a priori impossible. And so the question is one that you don't even look at, you just ignore. Now, there are wonderful books on the miracles and the possibility of them. I would recommend, for instance, Norman Geisler has a fantastic book on miracles in the modern mind. Terrific. There's a thicker book on it written by a bunch of different scholars that even deal with things like the resurrection and stuff that are on it. A guy named Guyvet is the editor of it that I would recommend to you. But let's make it simple. Are you guys okay with simple? Let's keep it simple here. If God exists, miracles are possible. Let me give you a quote from C.S. Lewis. He says this: "But if we admit God," in other words, if people admit the existence of God, must we admit miracle? Indeed, you have no security against it. That is the bargain. Theology says to you, in effect, admit God and with him the risk of a few miracles, and I in return will ratify your faith in uniformity as regards the overwhelming majority of events. In other words, what C.S. Lewis is saying, and all philosophers that are dealing with miracles agree with him, if God exists, then miracles can exist. By the way, as a side note, naturalistic philosophers believe in at least two miracles. Number one, the universe came into existence out of nothing. I always ask the Awana kids, what's nothing? And they say nothing is nothing. What can nothing do? Nothing can do nothing. And yet, they argue that there was a time when there was nothing. In fact, you can't even use the word time. But there was nothing, and then nothing became everything. That's a miracle. That's impossible. It can't happen. Not within naturalistic mind. The second one is the origin of life. There's a law in science called the law of biogenesis, which says life can only come from pre-existing life. Okay, so it's a law. In science, a law means no known exceptions. If there was one exception, it would no longer be a law. So the law of biogenesis says that life can only come from pre-existing life. So the question is, where did the first life come from? Well, the naturalistic scholar wants to argue that life came from non-living chemicals, which is impossible. So that's miracle number two. So they do actually believe in miracles, but only when they need to invoke them. Okay. Let's look into the meat now, and I'll keep an eye on the time here. The question I want to ask this morning after all that prolegomena is the question of, did Jesus die? This is actually where we need to begin. Because if Jesus never died, there is no resurrection. There may have been a resuscitation. There's lots of people that die, by the way, and then are resuscitated. Somebody's heart stops, they're clinically dead, boom, they zap them, they're alive. So we're talking about Jesus being dead. And we're talking about a resurrection. So he had to have died. So how do we know that Jesus died? Well, we could just take the quick answer and go home, and that is John 19 that we read says that Jesus died. But if we're looking at it from a historical evidence where we're trying to put together multiple attestation, enemy attestation, all this stuff, then how do we know that Jesus died? Well, this is what we call inference to the best explanation. In other words, we're dealing with probability here. Okay, Jesus didn't come in here this morning where, like Thomas, we saw the wounds. So we're going by the historical data that we have. So if we look at the data, how do we know that he died? Because believe it, not only are there people that don't believe that Jesus lived, there are other people who don't believe he actually died. A recent medical article dealing with the cause of Jesus' death comes to the conclusion he never died. So, what do we know? Well, we know that Jesus went through a whole series of abuse and torture before the crucifixion. Now, many of them are irrelevant to his death. You get your beard plucked out, you're not going to die with that. You get slapped in the face, you get spat upon, you're not going to die from that. So we need to look at the major things. And the major things come down to three things, okay? I'm going to give them to you and then I'm going to explain them. The first one is the scourging. The second one is the crucifixion itself. And the third one is the spear. So number one, the scourging. Scourging is not whipping. Okay, some of you aren't going to like the gory details here, but you're going to get some gory details here this morning. Not as many as I could give, but I'm going to give you some. One scholar compared whipping in comparison to scourging as the difference between getting an electrical shock and getting hit by a lightning bolt. Okay, I've been foolish enough that I've changed plugs at home and couldn't be bothered flicking off the panel downstairs and got a zap. Okay, it doesn't hurt, but you feel it. Okay, it's that versus getting struck by lightning. So yes, both are electricity, but really we're not dealing with the same thing. So Jesus didn't get whipped. He got scourged. Now, in fact, Jesus got scourged twice. Now, you may not know this, but the Synoptic Gospels mention his scourging after Pilate handed Jesus over to be crucified. But according to John, there was a scourging that took place before he did that. Because there was 3 different types of scourging that were done in the Roman legal system. And basically you go in intensification. The first one is you get roughed up pretty good. And it's usually to teach somebody a lesson. The second one is a form of punishment where usually after that, then you're released. And you probably have a long recovery. The third one was used in capital offenses. On extremely rare occasions, that was your death sentence. You would be scourged to death. But normally, it was for capital punishment. If you were going to be hung or crucified or whatever, scourging took place beforehand. And so it had to do with what the end goal was. Now, the first scourging that John mentions is the lighter of them. And again, light is a relative term. Jesus was beaten to a pulp. Now, the difference between a scourge and a whip is a scourge usually had 3 or more leather lashes on it, usually 3, and they would tie pieces of bone, rock, glass, metal to them, and you would be hit by it. And the idea is those things stick in, and when they pull back, it rips the skin off. Okay, I said it was gory, but this is real. This is what happened. Okay, and by the way, think in terms of this. If you don't like the gore, Jesus did this for you. Now, Roman and Jewish historians tell us that it was so bad, sometimes people died from the scourging. When they weren't trying to kill the person. That's how bad it was. Josephus mentions people's entrails showing and organs showing. They use the word flayed. It would tear the whole skin off so you could see in what's below. Sometimes ribs were broken. What they would do is he would strip you naked. They would tie you to a post. And there was usually 2 lictors is what they were called. Each one had a scourge. One would be on each side. And they would whip you with these scourges until they were tired out. They were trained to do it as close to death without killing someone. And so Jesus the first time was given the lighter one, which is he was in rough shape. But once he was sentenced to crucifixion, he got the second one, which was basically they would continue on until Jesus was in about as bad a shape as he could be, and yet still suffer and suffer and suffer on the cross. Now, why mention this? Because Jesus, when he went to the place of crucifixion, there was a phrase used in the ancient world for scourging, and they said you were half dead. You were half dead. That's how bad it was. Now, that's the first one. Okay, so they would be scourged. The second one is the crucifixion itself. Now, the crucifixion itself was designed to be the worst form of torture conceived by men. There are later stories of people being on the cross for days and days and days. Those may be apocryphal, we don't know. Generally, people lasted on the cross for a number of hours up until maybe a day or so. Okay, but it was the longest time of their life. Different shapes of cross, we don't need to get into all of this. Sometimes they would, when the crucifixions first started in ancient history, they were done on trees. That's why later on it says that Jesus was nailed to a tree, uses the word for tree, which was another name for crucifixion, because they would crucify people on trees. But later on, they began to use crosses. The original ones, called the simple cross, was just a post. You would just be put on, so usually you would be like this. Okay, because you don't have a cross beam at all. Later on, there was what's called the Tau cross. Think of it as a capital T. Then they had the little t, the lowercase t, which is what, if you're wearing a cross today, that's probably the shape that you have. And most scholars believe that that's what Jesus was because of the titulus that was put above his head. So it makes more sense if it's fastened to the piece that's above him. But we don't know that Jesus' cross was like that. There was actually a cross that was X-shaped. In fact, people could get creative in what they did. But anyways, when they would affix them, often they would affix them to the cross with ropes. But recent historical studies have shown that more often than not, people were nailed to the crosses. And the gospel writers tell us plainly that he was nailed. Again, multiple sources telling us that he was nailed to the cross. And John even makes mention when in the Thomas incident that Thomas wanted to see his nail-pierced hands. By the way, the word hand in Greek goes all the way up to your elbow. And most scholars believe that he was not crucified the nails through his hands because it can't hold. But it was put between the wrist bones. In fact, there's a nerve there that is the most painful place in your entire body to have a nail put. So he would have been put here, or there's a special place in your hand that some think that's what he was put, that's in the bones. But anyways, he was nailed there. Now, you're not going to be killed by the nails. Okay? He was also nailed through the feet. Either his feet were put one on top of each other and one nail was put through the bones on the top. Or in 1968, I believe it was, in Israel, they discovered a series of tombs, and in them they found these ossuaries, which are bone boxes. So somebody was laid when they died, and then a year later, they would go in and they would collect the bones and they would put them in a box. Okay, and sometimes they were very ornate boxes. They found the high priest Caiaphas's, actually, and it was highly ornated, had all these beautiful flowers carved into it. But anyways, in this, they actually found the first historical physical evidence for a crucified victim, because when they nailed his ankle to the cross, they couldn't get the nail out of his ankle, and so he was actually buried with it still in there. It was 4.5-inch long spike that they used, And in his case, what they did is they put one foot on each side of the cross and they nailed him through the ankles. Okay, you can go online and you can see pictures of it if you want, not for gore, but to see what it actually looked like. And they actually found a piece of olive wood that they used as a washer so that it wouldn't come out. And in this, when they found this man's bones, his name is Johannan, they actually found that the washer was still there. Why is this important? Because when you're on the cross, you have to figure out, how am I going to breathe? Because you're hanging from your wrists that are held there by nails and ropes, and your ankles, which are nailed to the post. So your posture wants to sink, and you can't breathe. And so you have to push with your ankles and pull with your wrists in order to raise yourself up to breathe. A recent study looking at 40 different medical articles throughout the past dealing with the cause of Jesus' death, in the vast majority, and they figured the number one cause of death in crucifixions is asphyxiation. So your lungs fill up and stuff, and you suffocate. And you get to the point where you can't pull yourself up anymore, which, by the way, later on in the account in John 19, remember it says that they came to break their legs? Okay, this is called crucifragium. And they would take a hammer or a mallet or something, and they would smash your shin bones. Now, that sounds cruel, but it's actually merciful in this. If your shin bones are busted, you cannot push up anymore. And so it's going to quicken the asphyxia, so you're going to die quicker. Now, we know from the gospel accounts that because it was the night before the Sabbath, they wanted to get them dead and off the crosses before the Sabbath began. And so that's why they were coming to break the bones, and they found that Jesus was already dead. So number one was the scourging, which Jesus would have been literally half dead then. Then he goes on the cross for a number of hours, and they come and look at him, and they find that they don't need to break his legs because he's already dead. Now, there's a great quote. I'm not going to give it to you, but there's a great quote that describes how they would know that he was dead, because people go through these jerking motions and stuff when they're on the cross, and their instinct to survive is kicking in. They're doing all these gyrations and stuff just to get some oxygen in. So if Jesus isn't moving anymore, it's because he's dead. And some of these are spasmodic movements. In other words, as your muscles and that going to spasm, you're moving without you trying to move. And when they see Jesus, and John says that Jesus, King James, he gave up the ghost. Okay, he gave up his spirit. Okay, and he was dead. Now, before we move on to the last one, I want to give you one last piece of history here. During the Jewish revolt, so from AD 66 through to 72-ish, there was a revolt between the Jews in Palestine, in Israel, with the Romans. They were trying to get their independence. And this is where the temple was destroyed in AD 70. But during this, the first century Jewish historian Josephus, he becomes on the Roman side. He was captured and became kind of on their side, probably just to survive. But anyways, and he wrote an account of the Jewish war and things like that, and he was writing it for the Romans. And he saw these three people that he knew being crucified, and he begged that they could be let go. And so they said, okay, take them down. They gave him the best medical care available. Two of them still died. Now, why is this important? Because anybody who says that Jesus was crucified and didn't die, that would be the only exception in history where somebody was actually left on a cross and survived it. even with two of Josephus's comrades, when they gave them the best medical care, took them down early, they still died. That's how bad it was. So to argue that Jesus went to the cross and didn't die is sheer nonsense. Okay, the final one is the spear. So according to John chapter 19, and it's only found here, although we have multiple attestation because there's other writers that mention spears being used. For instance, a scholar by the name of Quintilian makes mention of spears being used in order to finish them off. So John here isn't making this up when he talks about the spear, but they come to break his legs. And Jews demanded, and we assume the Romans as well, they demanded the evidence that the person is dead. Now, if you're the Roman soldier who's in charge of the crucifixion of Jesus, and they find out later on that he's still alive, what do you think is going to happen to you? They're probably going to stick you up on a cross or something like that. So they're going to make sure the person's dead. So he comes along and he takes a spear and he puts the spear through. So it says, chapter 19, verse 32, so the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first man and of the other man who was crucified with him. But coming to Jesus, when they saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. By the way, if he's not quite sure Jesus is dead, that's probably a good way to find out if he is. Smash his legs and see if he moves. Okay, if he's playing possum, something's going to happen then. But he sees he's dead, he knows he's dead, understands he's dead, so he doesn't break his leg. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out. Two medical theories on this. Okay, all the studies break down into two. One thinks that it pierced the lungs, and that's where the fluid comes out, because they believe that there was fluid that built up from the scourging. The better studies show that that's probably not likely. The scourging probably didn't produce enough fluid in the lungs for this to happen, but the standard view is that they actually punctured the heart. And there's a sac around the heart called the pericardium, which has a water-type liquid there, and so when it comes out, it does this. By the way, scholars tell us that if you think that dead people don't bleed, that's not true. Because somebody who is recently dead still will bleed. So you may hear that argument, dead people don't bleed. Well, by the way, if he wasn't dead, that would have finished him off. So they pierced him through the side into the heart. And out comes this flow of blood and water, showing that they pierced his heart. So if the scourging didn't kill him, and the crucifixion didn't kill him, certainly the spear wound would have killed him. Now let me give you one last reason here. And this one is more just using common sense than anything. Because let's say, as some people, this is called the swoon theory, that Jesus actually didn't die. They put him in the tomb, and as the swoon theory says, in the cool of the tomb, he revived. Somehow he got out of his clothes, and he somehow rolled away the stone, and then he appeared to them as this glorified, resurrected Messiah, and they all believe he had come back from the dead, and he was who he claimed to be. This is what an ultra-liberal scholar who lived from 1808 to 1874 in the beginning of rabid German liberalism. His name is David Strauss. This is what he said. Because he said, anybody who believes that Jesus didn't die, he says this, it is impossible that a being who had stolen half dead out of the sepulchre, who crept about weak and ill, wanting medical treatment, who required bandaging, strengthening, and indulgence, and who still at last yielded to his sufferings, could have given to the disciples the impression that he was a conqueror over death and the grave and the prince of life. Such a resuscitation could have only weakened the impression which he had made upon them in life and in death, but could by no possibility have changed their sorrow into enthusiasm, have elevated their reverence into worship. In other words, if Jesus did somehow get out of the tomb, the first thing they would have done is taken him to the local doctor, not worshiping him as the exalted, glorified, resurrected Lord and Savior. Now, this comes up later on in our study when we see about the change, the transformation in the apostles, how they go from fleeing to being martyrs. If Jesus came and that's what they saw, that's not going to give them hope. And so even this ultra liberal says that it's sheer nonsense to believe that Jesus coming out of the tomb, half dead, in urgent need of medical assistance, that they're going to believe that he was resurrected from the dead. So our beginning question today is, did Jesus die? Well, every single piece of evidence at our disposal says that Jesus died. One liberal said that the most well-attested fact in all of ancient history is the death of Jesus by crucifixion. So if you deny that Jesus of Nazareth died by crucifixion, then you have no grounds to believe anything in ancient history. Nothing. So don't believe anything about Alexander the Great. Don't believe anything about Julius Caesar. Don't believe anything in the ancient past. Nothing. Because this is the most certain event in all of ancient history, that Jesus of Nazareth died under the hands of Pontius Pilate by crucifixion. But we need to start there because, unfortunately, many people that you come in contact might actually believe the rubbish that they're reading on the internet or seeing on these crazy programs. And you need to be able to tell them why you know that he died. And we have at least, Bart Ehrman says that of the death of Jesus, we have at least 15 independent sources for his death. 15. Okay, according to the Jesus Seminar, which is an ultra radical group of New Testament scholars, they believe if you have 2, you're on good grounds. Bart Ehrman says we have 15. Paul Myers says in ancient historical studies, often 1 is enough. We have 15. So anybody believes, 1, that Jesus didn't live, and 2, that he didn't die by crucifixion, they're just making a statement. That's it. They have nothing to defend them. Okay, that was a lot, maybe too much, but we will stop there. I'm using, by the way, what Gary Habermas calls the minimal facts approach. In the minimal facts approach that Gary Habermas has come up with is there's all kinds of other evidence that we can use for the resurrection, but unless 3/4 of liberal scholars agree to it, he won't use it. So basically, he's stacking the deck in their favor and still showing we have an absolutely airtight case for the resurrection. So first of the minimal facts is that Jesus died by crucifixion, because no death, no resurrection. So Jesus is dead. That's the beginning of the story. Thankfully, not the end. Let's pray. Father in heaven, while many might not agree, it is really important that we look with detail at these things, not only so that our faith would be strengthened, but Lord, there are people who have been so brainwashed by nonsense that, Lord, if we do not equip ourselves to be able to give answers to these people, Lord, they will remain in doubt. They may still choose not to believe, Lord, but may it not be because we failed to do our diligence. Peter told us that we are always to be ready to give an account of the hope that we have. And the hope that we have is based not only on the death of Christ, but his resurrection. So, Lord, may we use this to equip ourselves, not so that we can beat people over the head with arguments, but so that, Lord, you might use us to be soul winners for Jesus Christ. If this is the stumbling block, Lord, that is in their life, Lord, you can use us to remove that stumbling stone. So, Lord, help us to be diligent in these matters. We pray these things in Christ's name. Amen.